The courtroom fell silent as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood before one of America's most intimidating federal judges. Justice William Alsup, known for his sharp wit and even sharper tongue, sat behind the bench with a slight smirk playing across his lips. What happened next would shock the legal world and change everything. Crockett had come to argue a case that everyone said she couldn't win. A voting rights challenge that legal experts called impossible. But when Justice Alsup did something that stunned the entire courtroom, laughing openly at her opening argument, nobody expected what came next. The 33-year-old Texas Congresswoman didn't back down. Instead, she delivered a response so fierce, so calculated, and so devastating that it left the veteran judge speechless. Within hours, the courtroom footage would go viral, sparking a national conversation about respect, justice, and who really holds power in America's courts. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button if you want to see powerful moments like this. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss when justice gets served. Now let's see how a young congresswoman took on one of America's toughest judges and won. Justice William Alsup had been terrorizing lawyers for over 2 decades from his federal courthouse. At 78 years old, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he was known throughout the legal community as the Intimidator. His sharp questions could reduce seasoned attorneys to stammering messes. His dry sense of humor often came at the expense of those who dared appear unprepared in his courtroom. Alsup's reputation was built on moments like these, publicly embarrassing lawyers who he felt wasted his time. He'd once made a patent attorney explain basic coding concepts for 3 hours straight. Another time, he forced a corporate lawyer to read aloud from a technical manual until the man's voice gave out. The legal community both feared and respected him, knowing that appearing before Alsup meant you better bring your A-game or face public humiliation. But Alsup had never faced anyone quite like Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine Crockett had already made waves in Washington as one of the youngest and most outspoken members of Congress. At 33, the former public defender from Dallas had built her career on taking on impossible cases and winning. Her colleagues knew her as someone who did her homework, came prepared, and never backed down from a fight, no matter how powerful the opponent. Growing up in St. Louis, Crockett had watched her grandmother struggle to vote in elections, where poll workers made the process as difficult as possible. That experience shaped her passion for voting rights and her determination to fight for everyday people who couldn't fight for themselves. She'd put herself through law school working 3 jobs, graduated top of her class, and spent years as a public defender taking on cases other lawyers wouldn't touch. When she won her congressional seat, Crockett quickly gained attention for her fierce questioning during committee hearings and her ability to break down complex legal arguments into simple terms that regular people could understand. But standing before Justice Alsup would be her biggest challenge yet. The case that brought them together seemed hopeless from the start. A new state law had created voting restrictions that civil rights groups called the most restrictive in decades. Early voting periods were cut in half, mail-in voting was severely limited, and polling locations in certain neighborhoods were reduced by 40%. The law's supporters claimed it was about election security. Critics called it voter suppression, plain and simple. 3 different legal challenges had already failed in lower courts. Federal judges had ruled that while the law was inconvenient, it didn't rise to the level of constitutional violation. Most legal experts agreed this wasn't a winnable case. The state's lawyers were confident. Justice Alsup, who would hear the emergency appeal, was known for being tough on voting rights cases, often ruling that states had broad authority to manage their own elections. But Crockett saw something others had missed. She'd spent weeks digging through legislative records, committee hearings, and private communications. What she found was a paper trail that told a very different story about the law's true intentions. The question was whether she could present that evidence in a way that would convince even the most skeptical judge. This wasn't just about one law in one state. Similar voting restrictions were being pushed across the country, and this case could set a precedent that would affect millions of Americans' ability to vote. If Crockett lost, it would signal to state legislators everywhere that federal courts wouldn't stop even the most aggressive voting restrictions. For Crockett personally, The stakes were even higher. This was her first time arguing before a federal appeals court, and doing it in front of Justice Alsup meant the entire legal world would be watching. A loss wouldn't just hurt the cause. It could damage her credibility and make it harder for her to be taken seriously in future legal battles. But there was something else driving Crockett that morning. She thought about her grandmother, who had passed away just 6 months earlier. The woman who had walked miles to vote despite intimidation tactics, who had taught young Jasmine that democracy only works when everyone has an equal voice. This case was for her, and for millions of others who deserved better than having their voting rights chipped away by politicians who feared their participation. As Crockett reviewed her notes one final time before entering the courtroom, she knew she was walking into the legal equivalent of a lion's den. Justice Alsup would test every argument, challenge every piece of evidence, and look for any weakness in her case. But she'd been preparing for this moment her entire career. She just didn't expect him to start laughing. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Legal reporters, civil rights activists, and law students filled every available seat. The state's legal team, led by a seasoned attorney general with a perfect record before federal courts, sat confidently at their table, briefcases full of precedent cases and constitutional arguments. Justice Alsup entered with his usual commanding presence, his black robes flowing as he took his seat behind the imposing bench. The court clerk called the session to order, and all eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett as she stood to present her opening argument. "Your Honor," Crockett began, her voice clear and strong, "this case is about more than voting procedures. It's about a deliberate, calculated effort to silence specific voices in our democracy." That's when Justice Alsup did something that shocked everyone in the room. He leaned back in his chair and let out a dry chuckle, not a quiet snicker, but an audible laugh that echoed through the silent courtroom. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I've heard this argument before. Every voting law that gets passed nowadays is supposedly part of some grand conspiracy. Do you have any actual evidence of intentional discrimination, or are we going to spend the morning listening to political speeches?" The courtroom tensed. Several people in the gallery exchanged glances. This was exactly what Alsup was known for, immediately putting lawyers on the defensive with sharp, dismissive comments designed to rattle them. Crockett didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor, I appreciate your directness. And yes, I do have evidence. Quite a lot of it, actually." She moved to the podium and pulled out a thick folder. "If I may, I'd like to present communications between the bill's sponsors that were obtained through Freedom of Information requests." Justice Alsup waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, let me guess. Some legislator said something inappropriate in an email? Congresswoman, I've been doing this for 25 years. Politicians say lots of things. What matters is what the law actually does, not the motivations behind it." Another chuckle from the bench, and this time a few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The state's attorneys were trying to hide their smiles. This was going exactly as they'd hoped. But Crockett pressed on. "Your Honor, these aren't casual comments. These are detailed strategic discussions about how to reduce turnout in specific demographic groups without triggering obvious legal challenges." "Allegedly," Alsup interrupted. "And even if true, the law applies equally to all voters, does it not? Show me where in this statute it specifically mentions race or party affiliation." This was the moment Crockett had been preparing for. She knew Alsup would try to dismiss her evidence before hearing it, so she'd prepared a presentation that would be impossible to ignore. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A." She activated a large screen at the front of the courtroom. "This is an internal memo from the lead sponsor of the bill to his chief of staff, dated 3 weeks before the bill was introduced." The screen lit up with an email that made several people in the courtroom gasp. The memo explicitly discussed reducing urban turnout and making it more difficult for certain groups to participate in off-year elections. Justice Alsup's smirk faded slightly, but he quickly recovered. "One email, Congresswoman. Politicians have been trying to gain electoral advantages since the founding of this country. That doesn't make every law they pass unconstitutional. Every law they pass unconstitutional." "I agree, Your Honor, which is why I have 17 more emails, 6 recorded phone conversations, and testimony from 3 legislative staffers who were present during strategy sessions." Crockett had done something that most lawyers never attempted in Alsup's courtroom. She'd come prepared for his skepticism with overwhelming documentation. But the judge wasn't ready to concede anything yet. "Even if I accept all of your evidence at face value," Alsup said. Leaning forward, "The legal standard for proving intentional discrimination in voting cases is extraordinarily high. You need to show not just that the law has a disparate impact, but that discrimination was the primary motivating factor. And even then, if the state can show a legitimate governmental interest, the law stands." This was where most lawyers would start to struggle. The legal standard for voting rights cases had been made deliberately difficult by decades of court precedents. But Crockett had spent months studying every relevant case, and she had an answer ready. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to the decision in Arlington Heights versus Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation, as well as the more recent decision in League of United Latin American Citizens versus Perry." She pulled out another set of documents. Both cases establish that when there's evidence of discriminatory intent, combined with a clear disparate impact, and when the stated governmental justification is shown to be pretextual, courts have both the authority and the obligation to intervene. Justice Alsup raised an eyebrow. "Pretextual? That's a strong word, Congresswoman. The state has provided extensive testimony about election security concerns." This was the moment Crockett had been building toward. She discovered something in her research that even the state's own lawyers probably didn't know about. "Your Honor, I'd like to present what I believe is the most significant evidence in this case." She pulled up another document on the screen. This is a report commissioned by the state legislature just 6 months before this bill was introduced. It's a comprehensive study of election security conducted by their own cybersecurity experts. The courtroom was dead silent as Crockett read from the report. "Based on our analysis of the previous 3 election cycles, we found no evidence of significant fraud related to mail-in voting, early voting, or polling location access. Current security measures are adequate and effective." She looked directly at Justice Alsup. "Your Honor, the state's own experts concluded that the problems this law claims to solve don't actually exist." For the first time since the hearing began, Justice Alsup wasn't smirking. He was reading the document on his own screen, his expression growing more serious by the second. But Crockett wasn't finished. Furthermore, when this report was presented to the Legislative Committee, the chairman ordered it to be classified and excluded from public hearings. The same chairman who wrote the memo about reducing urban turnout. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. What started as Justice Alsup's show of dominance over a young congresswoman had turned into something much more serious. The state's attorneys were frantically whispering among themselves, clearly caught off guard by evidence they didn't know existed. Justice Alsup set down his papers and looked directly at Crockett. His tone was different now, more measured, more respectful. "Congresswoman, this is quite compelling evidence. But I have to ask, if this information was available, why didn't the previous courts consider it?" Crockett had anticipated this question too. "Your Honor, the state successfully argued in lower court proceedings that the cybersecurity report was classified for security reasons and couldn't be released. It wasn't until last week that we were able to obtain it through a separate federal Freedom of Information request." "I see." Alsup was quiet for a moment, clearly processing the implications of what he'd just heard. "And you're prepared to authenticate all of this evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor. We have the cybersecurity experts who authored the report standing by to testify, as well as the legislative staffers who witnessed the classification order." The judge looked at the state's attorney. "Counselor, I think I need to hear your response to these allegations." But as the state's lead attorney stood up, his confident demeanor from earlier in the morning was completely gone. He cleared his throat nervously and began shuffling through his papers, clearly unprepared for the evidence Crockett had just presented. "Your Honor," he began hesitantly, we would need time to review these documents and prepare a proper response." That's when Justice Alsup did something that stunned everyone in the courtroom even more than his earlier laughter. He turned back to Crockett with what almost looked like admiration in his eyes. "Congresswoman," he said slowly, "in 25 years on this bench, I've seen a lot of lawyers claim they had smoking gun evidence. You appear to actually have it. The courtroom was electric with tension as Justice Alsup continued to study the documents Crockett had presented. The man who had started the hearing by openly mocking her arguments was now leaning forward, completely absorbed in the evidence she'd laid out. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice carrying a tone of respect that hadn't been there before. "Walk me through the timeline here. When exactly did the state commission this cybersecurity report, and when did the legislative committee vote to classify it?" Crockett moved to the center of the courtroom, no longer the nervous young lawyer facing an intimidating judge, but a skilled attorney who had just gained the upper hand in the most important case of her career. "Your Honor, the report was completed on March 15th of last year. The legislative committee received it on March 18th. According to the meeting minutes, which I also have here, the chairman immediately moved to classify the report as sensitive security information before any committee members could read it in detail." She clicked to the next slide on her presentation. The bill that we're challenging today was introduced exactly 1 week later, on March 25th, the same day that the chairman sent his email about reducing urban turnout. Justice Alsup was taking notes now, something observers in his courtroom rarely saw. And the committee members, were they aware of the report's conclusions when they voted on the bill? "No, Your Honor. In fact, during the public hearings, several committee members specifically asked about cybersecurity studies, and they were told that no such studies had been conducted." What happened next would be replayed in law schools for years to come. Crockett had connected dots that created an undeniable pattern of deception and discriminatory intent. "Your Honor, I'd like to present one more piece of evidence that ties this all together." She pulled up a calendar on the screen. "These are the meeting schedules for the Legislative Committee Chairman." Notice the entry for March 20th, 2 days after receiving the cybersecurity report. The calendar entry read, "Strategy Meeting, Voting Bill Implementation." Attendees: Legal Team, Demographic Consultants, Data Analysts. "Your Honor, we were able to obtain testimony from one of the data analysts who attended that meeting. He was told to prepare projections showing how different voting restrictions would affect turnout in specific zip codes and demographic groups." Justice Alsup set down his pen. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. The state commissioned a study that found no evidence of the problems their law claims to address. They then classified that study to keep it secret from the public and their own committee members. And at the same time, they were conducting detailed analysis of how to reduce voting in specific communities." "That's correct, Your Honor. The change in Justice Alsup was remarkable to witness. The man who had been dismissive and condescending just an hour earlier was now engaged and serious, asking detailed questions and taking extensive notes. Several legal reporters in the gallery were frantically typing, knowing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Congresswoman, in your view, does this evidence meet the Arlington Heights standard for proving discriminatory intent?" Crockett had been waiting for this question. "Your Honor, I believe it exceeds that standard. Arlington Heights requires evidence that discrimination was a motivating factor. Here we have evidence that avoiding discrimination was never even considered. The entire process was designed around demographic targeting while actively concealing information that would have undermined their stated justification." Justice Alsup nodded slowly. "And the impact analysis? You mentioned projections about specific communities?" "Yes, Your Honor. The data analyst's testimony indicates that the restrictions were specifically calibrated to have maximum impact in urban areas with high minority populations, while minimizing effects in rural and suburban areas with predominantly white populations." Throughout this exchange, the state's legal team had been growing increasingly desperate. Their lead attorney finally stood up, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Your Honor, if I may object to this line of questioning. The Congresswoman is presenting evidence that wasn't available during the original legislative process and Justice Alsup cut him off with a sharp look. "Counselor, are you suggesting that evidence of discriminatory intent becomes irrelevant simply because it was concealed during the legislative process?" "No, Your Honor, but are you disputing the authenticity of these documents? We haven't had adequate time to verify. Are you claiming that your client didn't commission the cybersecurity report that directly contradicts their stated justification for this law?" The state's attorney looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Your Honor, we would request a recess to properly review these materials. Justice Alsup leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, the courtroom was completely silent. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had just witnessed something that would change how he viewed not just this case, but his entire approach to voting rights litigation. Counselor, in my 25 years on this bench, I've heard every possible justification for voting restrictions. I've seen legitimate concerns about election security, and I've seen political gamesmanship. But I have never seen evidence this clear of a deliberate effort to deceive not just the courts, but the very legislators who voted on this bill. He turned to look directly at Crockett. Congresswoman, when I started this hearing, I was prepared to find that while this law might be inconvenient for some voters, it fell within the broad authority that states have to manage their elections. The courtroom held its breath. However, the evidence you've presented fundamentally changes the legal analysis. This is not a case about election security or administrative convenience. This is a case about using the power of government to deliberately suppress the voting rights of specific communities while lying about the reasons for doing so. What Justice Alsup did next shocked everyone in the room, including Crockett herself. Congresswoman, I owe you an apology. When you began your argument this morning, I made assumptions based on previous cases and my own preconceptions about voting rights litigation. I was wrong to dismiss your arguments before hearing your evidence. Your preparation and advocacy in this case represent exactly what our legal system is supposed to look like. Several people in the gallery audibly gasped. Justice Alsup, known for his stern demeanor and reluctance to admit error, had just publicly apologized to a lawyer he had mocked just hours earlier. Crockett, for her part, handled the moment with grace. Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate that more than you know. But this case isn't about me. It's about the millions of voters whose rights are at stake. Justice Alsup spent several minutes reviewing his notes before delivering what many would later call one of the most important voting rights decisions in recent history. Based on the evidence presented today, this court finds that the challenged law was enacted with discriminatory intent, creates an unjustifiable disparate impact on minority communities, and was justified through deliberately false statements about election security needs. He looked up at both legal teams. The state's motion to dismiss is denied. Congresswoman Crockett's motion for preliminary injunction is granted. This law cannot be implemented while this case proceeds through the courts, but he wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering the state to immediately declassify and publicly release the cybersecurity report that should have been part of the original legislative deliberations. The public has a right to know what their elected officials knew when they made these decisions. The reaction was immediate and electric. Civil rights activists in the gallery began applauding, though they quickly quieted when Justice Alsup raised his hand. Legal reporters were typing furiously, knowing they had just witnessed legal history. The state's attorneys looked shell-shocked, clearly understanding that this decision would have ramifications far beyond this single case. Crockett remained composed, but those who knew her could see the emotion in her eyes. She had not only won an impossible case, she had done it in a way that would make it easier for future voting rights challenges across the country. Justice Alsup concluded the hearing with words that would be quoted in law journals and civil rights circles for years to come. Democracy only works when it's based on truth, not deception. When government officials lie to justify restricting the fundamental right to vote, it is the duty of the courts to expose that deception and protect the rights of all citizens. As the hearing concluded, Crockett gathered her materials, knowing that her life and career had just changed forever. But more importantly, she knew that her grandmother would have been proud. Within minutes of the hearing's conclusion, cell phones throughout the courthouse were buzzing with activity. Legal reporters who had witnessed the dramatic transformation of Justice Alsup were rushing to file their stories, knowing they had just seen something unprecedented in federal court. The hashtag Juck Crockett vs. Alsup began trending within the first hour. As clips of the hearing spread across social media platforms, the image of the young Congresswoman calmly presenting her evidence while the veteran judge took notes became an instant symbol of preparation triumphing over prejudice. Civil rights organizations that had been pessimistic about the case were suddenly issuing victory statements. The Legal Defense Fund tweeted, This is what happens when brilliant preparation meets judicial integrity. Congresswoman Crockett just changed the game for voting rights nationwide. Major news networks interrupted their regular programming to report on the decision. Legal analysts who had predicted an easy victory for the state were scrambling to explain what had gone wrong with their predictions. I've covered Justice Alsup's court for 15 years, one veteran legal reporter told her audience. I have never seen him publicly apologize to an attorney, let alone praise their work so enthusiastically. This hearing will be studied in law schools for decades. Cable news shows devoted entire segments to analyzing the case, with constitutional law experts debating the broader implications. This decision doesn't just affect this one state, explained a former federal judge. It establishes a new standard for proving discriminatory intent in voting rights cases. Lawyers across the country are going to be citing this ruling. But it wasn't just legal experts who were paying attention. The hearing had captured the public imagination in a way that few court proceedings ever do. Social media was flooded with memes celebrating Crockett's victory, many focusing on the dramatic transformation of Justice Alsup from skeptical critic to respectful colleague. The decision sent shockwaves through political circles in both parties. Democratic leaders who had been cautious about supporting voting rights challenges suddenly found themselves with a powerful legal precedent to cite. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi issued a statement calling Crockett a brilliant legal mind who has struck a blow for democracy itself. Republican reactions were more muted but telling. Several GOP state legislators who had been planning similar voting restrictions quietly shelved their proposals, unwilling to face the kind of scrutiny that Crockett's evidence had brought to bear. The state's governor, who had signed the challenged law with great fanfare just months earlier, was forced to defend his decision in light of the cybersecurity report that his own administration had commissioned and then hidden. We acted in good faith based on the information available at the time, he told reporters, though his explanation satisfied few critics. For Crockett herself, the victory was both professional and deeply personal. In interviews following the hearing, she spoke about her grandmother's influence and her determination to ensure that every American has an equal voice in democracy. My grandmother used to tell me that the most powerful weapon against injustice is the truth. Carefully documented and clearly presented, Crockett said in a televised interview. Today proved that she was right, but Crockett was also careful to frame her victory in broader terms. This case wasn't about me proving something to Justice Alsup or anyone else. It was about proving that our legal system can work when lawyers do their homework and judges listen with open minds. The personal impact extended to Justice Alsup as well. Colleagues noted that the hearing seemed to have affected him profoundly. Bill has always been a fair judge, but I think this case reminded him why he became a judge in the first place, said a fellow federal judge who spoke anonymously. Within days of the decision, voting rights lawyers across the country were incorporating Crockett's strategy into their own cases. The combination of documentary evidence showing discriminatory intent, expert testimony debunking stated justifications, and careful timeline analysis became known as the Crockett Standard. Law schools began incorporating the case into their constitutional law curricula almost immediately. This is how you prepare a federal case, Professor Janet Morrison of Georgetown Law School told her students. Congresswoman Crockett didn't just win, she created a roadmap for future voting rights litigation. The decision also had immediate practical effects. 3 other states that had passed similar voting restrictions found themselves facing new legal challenges that directly cited Crockett's evidence and legal strategy. Within weeks, 2 of those states voluntarily modified their laws rather than face the kind of scrutiny that had destroyed their counterpart's case. When the previously classified cybersecurity report was finally released to the public, its contents proved even more damaging to the state's position than Crockett had indicated during the hearing. The report not only found no evidence of significant election security problems, it actually praised the existing system as more secure and reliable than the national average. The report's release triggered investigations by legislative oversight committees, who demanded to know why elected officials had been told that no security studies existed when in fact a comprehensive analysis had been completed months earlier. This isn't Just about voting rights, said the ranking minority, member of the state legislature's oversight committee. This is about fundamental honesty in government. If officials are willing to lie about something this important, what else aren't they telling us? The impact of Crockett's victory extended far beyond voting rights law. Government accountability organizations began using her documentation techniques to investigate other cases where officials might have hidden evidence that contradicted their public justifications for controversial policies. Freedom of information attorneys found that Crockett's multi-pronged approach to obtaining classified documents provided a new template for accessing information that government agencies preferred to keep secret. What, Congresswoman? Crockett did was show that with enough persistence and creativity, it's still possible to hold government officials accountable for their actions, said Marcus Williams, director of a government transparency nonprofit. Her case is going to inspire a generation of lawyers who believe in the power of truth to overcome political deception. Despite the victory in federal court, Crockett knew that her work was far from over. The state announced its intention to appeal the decision, setting up a potential battle at the appellate court level, and possibly even the highest court in the land. This is just the beginning, Crockett told supporters at a rally following the decision. Every victory in the fight for voting rights has to be defended, and there will always be those who prefer that some voices go unheard. We can't let our guard down. But Crockett also expressed optimism about the broader implications of her victory. What happened in that courtroom shows that our legal system still works when people are willing to do the hard work of uncovering the truth. Justice Alsup reminded us that even the most skeptical minds can change when presented with clear evidence. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the case's aftermath was the continued evolution of Justice Alsup himself. In subsequent hearings, observers noted that his questioning style had become more thoughtful and less combative. He began asking lawyers more detailed questions about their evidence and preparation. Rather than simply challenging their legal theories, it's like watching someone remember why they fell in love with the law in the first place, observed one attorney who regularly appeared before Alsup's court. He's always been smart and fair, but there's a new level of engagement that wasn't there before. Alsup himself seemed aware of the change. In a rare public appearance at a legal conference several months later, he spoke about the importance of judges remaining open to having their assumptions challenged. The moment we stop listening to evidence because we think we already know the answer is the moment we stop being judges and become obstacles to justice, he told the audience. I learned that lesson from a young congresswoman who was better prepared than I was willing to admit. A year after the hearing, legal scholars were already calling Crockett versus State one of the most significant voting rights decisions of the decade. The case had established new precedents for proving discriminatory intent, created new strategies for obtaining classified government documents, and demonstrated the power of thorough preparation to overcome even the most challenging legal obstacles. But perhaps more importantly, the case had shown that the American legal system could still surprise people. In an era of increasing cynicism about institutions and partisan division, the sight of a skeptical judge publicly acknowledging that he had been wrong and praising the lawyer who had corrected him provided a reminder of what justice could look like when it worked. Properly, this case gives me hope, said Maria Rodriguez, a first-year law student who had watched the hearing online. It shows that if you work hard enough and prepare thoroughly enough, you can still make a difference, even against the most intimidating odds. For Crockett, the lasting impact went beyond legal precedents and media attention. She had proven to herself and others that the lessons her grandmother had taught her about the power of truth and preparation could still change the world. One carefully documented case at a time. My grandmother always said that democracy is not a spectator sport, Crockett reflected in an interview on the anniversary of the hearing. She was right. It requires all of us to do the hard work of holding our institutions accountable. Sometimes that means standing up in a courtroom and presenting evidence that powerful people would prefer to keep hidden. But that's what democracy looks like in action. As the case continued through the appeals process, legal observers waited to see whether Crockett's victory would stand up to higher court scrutiny. But regardless of the ultimate outcome, her performance in justice, Alsup's courtroom had already changed both the legal landscape and the lives of everyone who witnessed it. The story of a young congresswoman who came prepared to fight and a veteran judge who was wise enough to listen had become more than just a legal victory. It had become a reminder of what American democracy could accomplish when truth and preparation met institutional integrity. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Justice William Alsup proves that preparation, persistence, and truth can still triumph over prejudice and institutional skepticism. In a world where many young people feel powerless against established systems, Crockett's victory shows that thorough research and unwavering commitment to justice can change minds and create lasting impact. This story reminds us that democracy requires active participation from all citizens, whether in courtrooms, legislative halls, or voting booths. When we do our homework, present our evidence clearly, and refuse to be intimidated by those who underestimate us, we can achieve victories that seemed impossible. If this story inspired you to believe that change is still possible when people are willing to fight for what's right, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss more stories of ordinary people achieving extraordinary victories. Because the fight for justice never ends, and the next hero could be anyone willing to do the work and stand up for what they believe in. What do you think? Should more young leaders follow Crockett's example of thorough preparation and fearless advocacy? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that persistence and truth can still win the day.